Hello, everybody. It's good to be back. I was just in Europe for almost 3 weeks, mainly Eastern Europe. So it's really good to come back to America, as beautiful as Europe is. But this is home, and get right into my favorite crowd. So today we're going to do a little an event or lecture that it's a Saturday night, festive, and we're going to talk about Christmas and Hanukkah and how they relate and how they're different, of course. And this is really what Project Genesis is all about: is bringing together Judaism and Christianity. Showing how we're similar in many ways, but yet different. And that's really the interesting part of it, is how we're different, but how we can really find common denominator. I just want to say one thing that connected to my trip in Europe. Everybody now in Europe is reacting to our election. And they, of course, as you probably see and hear, a lot of these governments in Europe becoming more and more kind of right wing. And it seems like there is an idea here that we capture here that somehow the world reacts to it. It's really nice to be together and to find our similarities in the world. It's really great to know that we're all human beings. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all want to have good lives and believe in some higher force. But we are different also. And I think people want to, when you push too far to saying we're all the same, people push back on that. And they say, no, we're not all the same. We do want to keep our unique identity, right? And sometimes it's not economically right to do it or wise, like the Brexit, but people want to keep their identity, and that's very, very important. So I'm always for that, for people to keep their identity. Our purpose in Project Genesis is not to say, you know what, it's all the same. It's not. It's to show the common denominator, but yet to emphasize where we are different and we are unique, which makes it a lot more interesting and beautiful and diverse. So with that, I will point out to Don to begin explaining about Christmas. And then I will jump in.
I just want to add to what Gadi had said. Since I began working with him and become familiar with him, I can tell you one thing, that my Roman Catholicism and my spiritual bearings have become much deeper, all right? And because the understanding, one of the things that we share are the roots, okay? And the roots especially on a spiritual level. We have not really talked much about doctrine or dogma at all. What we're talking about is very often presenting a situation and looking at where everything kind of comes together. We haven't rehearsed one of these in 3 years. And those of you who have heard us talk, it seems like that we do rehearse because we kind of come out on the same level. And I know when Gadi we're doing this because of him. He wanted to learn the New Testament. And I can remember after a while, his coming in front of the crowd and saying, I hope every Jew that I know reads the New Testament. And I know that I would say the same thing to every Christian about trying to read the Old Testament. All right? And there are many reasons, and he'll fill you in on this. Tonight, I'm going to kind of do a light presentation. It's not earth-shattering. It shouldn't change anybody's faith. It's about a question that is, in many circles, interesting, but not earth-shattering. But I think there's an interest there. And what I'm going to basically talk about is to try to answer the question, how did December 25th come associated with the birthday of Jesus? Okay? So we're going to kind of take a look at that, look a little bit at the history. Now, first of all, those of you who don't know me, my position in looking at the Bible and the scriptures and religious stories, I am what they call a contextualist. I am not a biblical fundamentalist. I am not a literalist. And I kind of go by this quirky little statement, which to me keeps reminding me of what I'm about in interpreting. Now that statement is, a text without a context becomes a pretext to answer any questions you wanted to ask and to answer. A text without a context becomes the pretext to take on any meaning you want it to. All right? And that's not exactly what, in old theology, we used to say we can run to the Bible and get an answer for everything. All right? I remember in the days when Jerry Falwell started the moral majority, I can remember they're coming out and saying, well, we can find the basis for capitalism in the book of Jeremiah. Okay? So there is this element who goes to the scriptures and pick out a quote out of context to prove X, Y, and Z. I'm not coming from there. I firmly believe that religious scriptures and religious stories are metaphorical. All right? Because the only way that a human being can talk about God or anything supernatural is by analogy and metaphor. All right? I mean, the old philosophers would say, how do you talk about God? And the first thing you would do in a philosophy class is state what God is not. So you work from the negative. God is not this, God is not that. Okay? So that's kind of where I'm moving from. And we're going to start basically, obviously, with the well-known Christmas stories. How did December 25th come to be associated with Jesus' birthday? Well, first of all, the Bible offers few clues, if any. There's no dating. Okay? What we're talking about are celebrations or festivities, how they have come to be manifest in the history. Dates are not given in the New Testament, not even the time of year. Now, I know in one of the versions of the Christmas story it said that shepherds were out tending their flocks. All right? But most scholars would say, those stories were meant to be theological. Don't spend a lot of time trying to find a minute detail which really doesn't matter. But if you want to go along with it, the tending of the sheep is usually in lambing season, which would be in the spring. Okay, but we're not going to go there, and not in any serious way. Now, extra biblical evidence. Sources from outside the Bible about these festivals is very sparse. There's no mention of birth celebrations in the early church. Writers like St. Irenaeus and Tertullian in the middle of the first century. No mention of birthday celebrations. In fact, the theologian Origen in the mid-200s came out and he mocked the Roman festivities, the pagan festivities, all right? And so of the Roman festivities of celebrating famous births. So obviously, if a theologian like Origen would come out and say that, it's a good chance that the Christians were not celebrating Christmas at this point. But one of the things we have to remember, and it becomes the key later on, the focus, as we'll see later on, and what is more celebrated, is the death of Jesus. The Gospels provide pretty detailed information as to the time of Jesus' death. And today, you know, we have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of the 4, the Gospel that seems to be most used to understand when Jesus was crucified is John's Gospel. John has Jesus crucified the day before Passover, the 14th day of Nisan, when the sheep was slaughtered. So the idea was in John, when Jesus dies on the cross, was the time of day that the sheep, the lambs, were being slaughtered, getting prepared for Passover. So Easter became for Christians a reinterpretation of Passover in terms of Jesus' passion. That's how the Easter event kind of grew. Easter was definitely a Christian feast by the mid-2nd century. Right. But over time, Jesus' origins would become a concern. Now, what is very interesting in the Gospels and in Paul's epistles, the earliest writings in the Gospels, the epistles of Paul, the Gospel of Mark, have no mention of the birth of Jesus. Matthew and Mark have 2 nativity stories, what we call infancy narratives. Totally distinct, totally different. What we've done in the modern age, in literature and in art, we've tended to combine the 2 stories of Matthew and of Luke. But they're totally different. The emphases are totally different. One emphasizes Joseph, one emphasizes Mary. Okay? And, I mean, that's we can talk about that later on. But there are no dates given in any of these. In the 2nd century, we find details about Jesus' birth and his young life in the scriptures that are called apocryphal. In other words, they're not accepted in the true canon of the scriptures of Christianity. So we find that, for example, there's an infancy gospel of Thomas, and there's a proto-gospel of James. And in these gospels, which are outside the canon of the scriptures, there are all these stories and information about Jesus' birth and his younger life and details and so on and so forth. But still, no date is ever given. At about 200, we jump to Northern Africa. Now, Northern Africa had a certain influence in the early church. There is a reference that there was a Christian teacher in Egypt who was talking about the dates that the North African Christians were using to talk about the day when Jesus was born. They were all based upon the Egyptian calendar, so don't ask me any questions about that. I haven't a clue as to what the Egyptian calendars look like. But I do know they were all set in April, May, or June, what we would in our calendar. So you begin to see the development of dates in around the year 200 in northern Africa. In the late 2nd century, the 100s, there becomes more and more of an interest in dating the day of the birth. By the 4th century, now the 4th century was the century that Constantine was converted to Christianity. All right. But by the 4th century, there were references to when the Nativity was celebrated. Interestingly enough, one was December 25th in the West and January 6th in the East. Okay? And we're all familiar with Christmas on December 25th and the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th. Okay? Now, there's all sorts of symbolism that are connected with that and the 12 days of Christmas in between. We can talk about that too a little bit later. So the earliest mention of December 25th comes from an almanac, a Roman almanac. And the first item in this almanac stated that Jesus of Nazareth was born on December 25th. Now, there was a group in northern Africa who were heretics, right? And St. Augustine tried to fight them. They were very traditionalists. And one of the things that they did, they refused, they claimed Christ was born on December 25th, but they wouldn't celebrate the Epiphany because it was an addition. Somebody just added it to the calendar. So you've got these tensions, but still in northern Africa, you've got this speaking now of certain dates. In the East, January 6th, even today, the Orthodox celebrate Christmas on January 6th. But January 6th for the Easterners was a comprehensive date. It wasn't just when the Magi came and when Jesus was born. January 6th stood as the date when the whole shebang was celebrated. What we would call Christmas and Epiphany and so on. All right? So it wasn't separated January 6th back then. Now, 12 days after January 6th, the East celebrates Epiphany. But that was a historical development. So, we've got two theories. One more popular and one more scholarly. And most of us have heard about the popular interpretation. And that has to do with pagan feasts. Did Christianity take over pagan feasts to celebrate? There's still debate about that. But the first theory is that Christmas was borrowed from pagan celebrations. And we're still talking about celebrations. Okay? Now, the Romans had three interesting celebrations. All right? First one is the Saturnalia, the god Saturn. And that took place, what we would say, in around the solstice. All right? And Saturn was the god of agriculture. Okay, so this feast became absolutely raucous. All right, it was the time of year the animals had been slaughtered, so the farmers wouldn't have to feed the animals during the winter. All right, and everything got topsy-turvy. The servants became rulers. The kids became what kids probably are today, but back then, they took over for the parents and all of that. It was a crazy feast. At the same time, there comes now into play a feast for the Juvenalia, or it was a children's feast. And the children would go around and they would be asking for money from the rich people, and if the rich people didn't fork up, it was kind of like trick-or-treat type of thing. All right? And then there was associated, and this is the important one, a feast called Mithras. And what that was a feast that celebrated the unconquerable or the unconquered Son, S-U-N. Okay? That was called the feast, the Mithras was the original name for it, but it was the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquerable Son. Some say that Christmas was a spin-off from these solar festivals. Everything centered around the sun. Now you understand why, because the celebrations came at a time where the days started to become longer. So the sun was in the process of taking over. All right? That's what the great solstice celebration is in the winter. The days, the sun is getting brighter, and the days are getting longer. Celebration of the sun. And some say that the Christians then adopted these feasts throughout the Roman world. However, the problem is that we find no mention of that in early Christian writings. But interestingly enough, there is a connection that some found back then between Christ as the true Son, S-U-N, who outshone the pagan gods. But the early Christians saw that more as not as a feast to celebrate, but kind of as a natural proof that God gave us that to show that Christ as the new Son would overcome the pagan gods. Right? But that was nothing set in stone yet. Jumping to the 12th century, we'll come back, there's the first suggestion of Jesus' birth as a deliberately set at the time of pagan feasts. Okay? And I think that's what most of us have kind of grown up with. That the church has a tendency to take pagan feasts and substitute religious feasts on top of them. Those who are familiar with Catholic Saint Joseph. All right? One of the examples, much later on in the 20th century, was that St. Joseph's feast was usually celebrated on March 19th. But May 1st, being May Day in the communist countries, all right, what the church did was they made the feast on May 1st, made the feast of St. Joseph the Worker. So it would coincide with the May Day feast of the workers in communist countries. That's just a simple example. Christmas was a holiday that was shifted from January 6th to December 25th, so it fell on the same day as the day of the unconquerable Son. Okay? But there are problems with this. Now, if you realize that in the 200s, the Christians were not too anxious to compare or to use pagan feasts. Why not? Because they were being persecuted. They were being persecuted pretty much until the year 312. So there was this tendency, don't try to explain too much, because the early Christians would have been very uncomfortable in substituting the Christian feasts to the pagan feast while they were being persecuted. All right? So that's a problem with that theory. And as we'll see at the end, when I tie it all up, my basic conclusion is, how do we know that the date was December 25th? And the answer is, we don't. There is nothing firmly set. But the history is and then we're coming to the second theory, which is where our Jewish brethren have an idea in their Talmud, which I'll look at in a moment, of helping us to somehow coordinate in Christianity what the days of Christmas celebrate. The first recorded date of Christmas being celebrated is in the year 336, and in the year 350, that's the date when the church officially declared December 25th as Christmas. Pope Julius I. All right? And it wasn't declared a national feast in the United States until 1870, just so that we know. Now, here's the other account. The other account fits in with, and this was an account which was not well known because it was known more among scholars than anywhere else. The key to dating lies in the dating of Jesus' death at Passover. So, how do we figure out, well, they figured out when Jesus was crucified. In 200, the theologian Tertullian figured out that day of Nisan, all right, was the equivalent to March 25th. All right, was the equivalent to our calendar's March 25th in the Roman solar calendar. March 25th, let me test the knowledge of some of the Catholics here. Do you remember what feast we celebrate on March 25th? My birthday. Were you wrapped in swaddling clothes? Good, I'll remember that. It's in Catholic circles, March 25th is the celebration of the Annunciation, the day on which Jesus was conceived. So what we see is the day that Jesus was conceived is the same date as his crucifixion. And therefore, 9 months from the day he was conceived is December 25th, and we end up with a date for Christmas. All right? Now, that thinking, okay, so Jesus was believed to have been conceived and crucified on the same day. Exactly 9 months later, Jesus was born on December 25th. Instead of working from the 14th day, I'm going to talk about the Eastern churches now. So instead of using the 14th day of Nisan as the date of the crucifixion, they used the 14th day of their spring calendar, when their spring began, the 14th day, which lands on April 6th. Jesus was crucified on April 6th. All right. He was at the same time conceived on April 6th, and 9 months later you have January 6th. So that's how the dates came to be manipulated. And remember, we're talking about a human structure here that would help the growing communities understand and make sense. Because the death of Jesus was always wrapped up, not the death of Jesus, but the conception of Jesus was, and the death of Jesus on the same day was wrapped up in the whole idea of that this is the spectrum of a time of redemption. Okay? So, and in fact, in early art, what you see is pictures of the Annunciation, and you have actually pictures of Jesus, the baby Jesus after being conceived, is coming to earth either carrying or sitting on a cross. Okay? So the idea of redemption was always tied up with the conception of Jesus. Now, let's look at the ancient Jewish tradition, and I'm looking forward to what, because I'd asked Gadi, I was reading part of the Talmud, and it's still a little confusing for me, but he's going to clear up everything, as he always does. The notion in Judaism, at least according to the Talmud, was that the notion that creation and redemption should occur at the same time of year. So there's a tractate in the Talmud where you have two rabbis arguing with one another. What else is new, right? There?
3 rabbis.
Yeah, that's true. 3 rabbis. That would make it hard. One rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, says this. In Nisan, which, now you're going to remember too, the Jews have 4 New Year's days. All right, Gadi will mention that. There are 4 separate New Year's days in the Jewish calendar. Nisan was the month of Passover. So Rabbi Eliezer says, in Nisan, the world was created. In Nisan, the patriarchs were born. On Passover, Isaac was born. And in Nisan, our ancestors will be redeemed in time to come. Now, the rabbi he was arguing with was Rabbi Joshua. And Rabbi Joshua made the same argument, but instead of using the month of Nisan, he uses the month of Tishri, which is another month of one of the Jewish New Years. So Gadi will explain and clear that all up for you. Okay? So basically, the theological, spiritual underpinnings we find are very well connected, or very much connected, by the Jewish influence even in the early church, where somehow conception and crucifixion were all wrapped up with the idea of redemption. And then what happens is that the birthday is always 9 months after the conception. But everything is kind of wrapped up there, right? And that, to me, really makes, and folks, I'm no scholar about any of this, but it's the first time in all my years I've ever heard that argument. And when I started researching this, it certainly makes eminent sense. That if you're looking at a theological structure, which we are, you're looking at the scriptures and the spiritual underpinnings of both religions, all right? They're connected. There is not that much of a distance at its very root of the Jewish position and the Christian position about birthdays, redemption, creation. And I know when it comes to creation, the Jews have a tremendous respect and understanding of creation and everything being brought back to the Garden of Eden. One quick note. Somebody was telling me the other day they were in Israel and they were doing the tour of the holy sites in Jerusalem. And he said the guide, now this could be apocryphal, I'm sure it is, but it's interesting how the association comes to be. The guide said that Mount Golgotha, the mount where Jesus was crucified, sits on top of the grave of Adam. So again, you've got all of these things coming into play and intertwining, but that's just kind of a short history on where we get, has nothing to do with the meaning necessarily of Christmas, but where the festival and the date come from. I'll let Gadi fill you in on the Jewish tradition of Hanukkah and anything else. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I thank Don for giving me all the credit of explaining everything. I'm still working on that. It's still looking for answers myself, and I think that's why I think when you're a psychiatrist, you probably looked for some sort of answers for yourself before you became a psychiatrist. I feel like being a rabbi is because I first was looking for answers for myself, and that brought me to to be a rabbi. So I don't have all the answers, but let's see what we can.
That's not what you tell me.
The what?
That's not what you tell me.
It's the Hanukkah and Christmas, of course, are two different holidays, but somehow they happen to be around the same time. And part of why Peconic Landing wanted to do this event this year is because Hanukkah and Christmas will fall on the same day this year, and that happens once in a while. But it's very it's special, and it reminds us that it does have some sort of a common denominator, and we'll look at it now. So Hanukkah, the word Hanukkah, means to dedicate. To dedicate. Hanukkah means to dedicate. And it means to, in this case, is to dedicate the house of God, is the temple in Jerusalem. In the 2nd century BCE, there was a war between during the time of the Second Temple, there was a war between the Syrian Greek and the Israelites, the Jews that lived in the land. So the Jews wanted to do a Brexit, their own Brexit. They didn't want to be controlled by the Greeks anymore, and the Greeks wanted to control them. And they said they went to battle, and they won. The little Jewish group in the land won the big Greek army. So we have, in a sense, a military victory, but we really celebrate something a lot more than that, than the military victory. So why rededicate the house? Because in the times of the Greeks, they put idols in the holy temple. They removed the Jewish identity from the temple and made it an idol worshiping, or the worshiping for the Greek gods. So when the Jews won that war, they cleared the temple again from the idols and rededicated to be a Jewish place of worship. So that's Hanukkah. That's really the terms. I'm not going to concentrate too much on the dates and the war itself, because I don't think that's really the most important thing. And actually, the rabbis of the Talmud also didn't think it was the most important thing. We today don't really celebrate the military victory. We celebrate it in terms of just mentioning it in our prayer book. But the whole ceremony that we have on Hanukkah is really celebrating light. Both Hanukkah and Christmas share that idea of the light. Same in the church. I came up with a term after speaking with Don this week. I call it constructed theology. I don't know if anybody else actually, if you ever heard that before. I don't know, maybe somebody else came up with that too. But constructed theology is something that the church does and did, and the Jewish rabbis did also during the time of the Talmud and been doing. What it means is to take an event, which I don't necessarily think everything is metaphorical. I don't see here we may disagree a little bit. I don't see, and when I asked Don if he wanted a real glass of water or a metaphorical one, I was actually also making a point there. I don't believe that everything is metaphorical. Actually, the whole challenge is to take the scripture and try to understand what we need to take metaphorically and what we need to take actually literally. So, but the constructed theology is to take an event and use it for theological purposes. So, for example, we know, and I don't think, the church will never say that Jesus was born on December 25th, right? But for the purpose of the Catholic theology, or the Christian theology, they placed it there. That's where they're holding the birthday. My mother, for example, they came from, my parents came from Yemen, and they were children when they walked through the desert to get to Israel. And at that time, they actually didn't register women. So my mother doesn't have a birthday. She doesn't know her birth date. She knows the year, but she doesn't know the exact date. And her name is Ora, which means light in Hebrew. So her mother said, "Oh, you were born around Hanukkah." So she thought, okay. But then she spoke to her years later, and she said, "No, it was because of the summer," or something like that. Like, so two totally confusing dates that had light in them. So she really doesn't know when her birthday is. So symbolically, she celebrates it on Mother's Day. So that's really that's the idea. So, but the point is that event happened historically at a certain point. But for the purpose of the theological purpose, the church and the rabbis placed it in a different time. So we celebrate Hanukkah always on the 25th of Kislev. There's the Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev. It's really the third month after the high holidays, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when we celebrate it, is not necessarily when it happened. And the different interpretation of when exactly it happened, and when they rededicated the temple, and when they even came up with the idea of celebrating Hanukkah. That happened a century later. So, it's not something that we know for sure that on that day they dedicated or rededicated the temple. This is the date that they chose to celebrate the rededication. And really that is the most important thing about it. So what is that date? And that's, I want to talk about that a little bit. Don introduced the idea of creation and redemption. So for us, the whole Bible, when we talk about the Torah and Scripture, we say it's from creation to redemption. The 5 books of Moses really start with the creation, right? But the point is to get to redemption. So we celebrate those two events as well. As Don mentioned, the Talmud tells us that there are 4 beginning of years. When we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, right, it's on usually around September, October, because we follow, of course, the moon cycle, and we adjust to the sun. So it's not always on the same Gregorian date, but it's around September, October. This is when Rosh Hashanah celebrates the creation of the world. So the discussion in the Talmud, different rabbis had different opinions of when the world was created. And part of that discussion was because they wanted redemption and creation to be together. This is probably the most important idea about Hanukkah, that creation and redemption come together. The rededication of the temple means that it's a creation, because it brings together the house again, it creates the house again, but it also celebrates redemption, right? The redemption of the Jewish people. So it's not really about necessarily the house itself, but the fact that they can worship in the house. And creation and redemption is exactly these two ideas. The world was created theologically speaking, the world was created so that we can worship God. So when the world was created, it wasn't created for nothing. It was created in order that a people will come later and will worship God. So we say that the creation happened in Tishrei, the first in Tishrei, and the redemption of the Jewish people happened on Passover. Okay, so that's 6 months later. It's like the night and day. It's in the Jewish calendar, the 12 months. Then there's the creation on one side, and then redemption is the bookend of that, these 6 months. So we want to say that creation and redemption happen together, but we happen to say that these two dates are separate. In our calendar, on the Jewish calendar, they happen separately, in a sense. The creation, on Rosh Hashanah we celebrate creation, and on Passover we celebrate redemption. However, redemption and creation go hand in hand. So creation itself symbolizes redemption, the beginning of redemption, and redemption reminds us of creation. It's always, they go hand in hand. In Hanukkah, even though it's not a biblical holiday, they come together. And this is why it was very important. And it was important for the rabbis to place it at that time of year, which is the winter solstice, and this is when the light starts to increase. So we come down and then we come up. The idea of creation and redemption, they go together, even though we separate this. As Don mentioned, when he started reading that part of the Talmud, is not just important for Hanukkah, but it is essential to understand the Bible. That whatever concept that you use for creation, that would be the two separate forces. The creation is the material, and the redemption is the spiritual. So if we bring it to Hanukkah, the creation can be the military victory. It's a creation. It's coming back to the house. But the redemption is really what we do with the house. Okay? And the worship. So what are we really celebrating on Hanukkah? What we're celebrating is the spiritual aspect of it, and it's in the form of a miracle. We celebrate a miracle that happened on Hanukkah, which, according to the story, after the war ended and there was the victory, they entered the temple, and they found one little jug with pure oil. So pure oil is not just regular oil. Pure oil was used to light the menorah in the temple. Pure oil is the first drop of each olive. That's how you make the pure oil. The second drop already goes to a second grade of oil, but that's not the pure oil that was used in the temple. So they, in a sense, it's like when you drive, at least it's very prevalent in Europe, it's diesel. To have car with diesel fuel. So you can't use diesel for other cars and vice versa. So you have to use the pure oil for the menorah in the temple. But that takes 8 days to produce. The minimum amount takes 8 days to produce. Because it's so labor intensive and the one drop, it takes a long time. So the miracle was that that little jug that they found lasted 8 days to light the menorah until they were able to produce new oil. Okay? Now, this is where I say, I don't know if I should take this literally. I don't know if that's exactly what happened. I don't know. It's a story. But what the story means is that we're not, even if the story was created somehow, right? The point of the story was to tell us that we're not celebrating we're acknowledging the military victory. But really we need to celebrate and bring to light, pun intended, I guess, to bring to light the celebration of the spiritual aspect of this whole thing. And that spiritual aspect is to light a little, to bring the light back, right? And for that story, it fit perfectly to put the celebration of Hanukkah in that time of year. Because we're celebrating the increase of light. And really that is the whole point. The whole point is not for creation to be for nothing, but for the spirituality that we put in it, in the light that we put in it. About the menorah, the Hanukkah. So this is the Hanukkah, is the menorah for Hanukkah. If you look at it, I can't light it. You probably ask yourself, how come it's all set and he's not lighting it, right? So I'm forbidden from lighting it. There's one of the most important laws of Hanukkah is that the candles, the Hanukkah candles, cannot be used any time or for any other purpose than Hanukkah, because it's that meaning. It's so specific that we can't use it anytime else. So, but I wanted to show you the Hanukkah, of course, and talk about it a little bit. The rededication of the temple was symbolic in a sense because they also wanted to create peace among the Jewish people themselves. There was a lot of internal conflict between the Jews at the time, and we know that when the temple was destroyed, but 150 years later, it was destroyed because of internal strife. So the community just weakened itself so much that the Romans, it was just destroyed the temple. So this is supposed to be in a sense, symbol for peace as well. So what we do is, we learn from the Hanukkah how to create peace in the house, so to speak. So the discussion in the Talmud of how to light the menorah, the Hanukkah, has to do with a lot of that too. Light in the light itself symbolizes peace in the house, and we learn that from the candles of Shabbat. So the whole discussion of how to light the Hanukkah candles is in the tractate, in the Talmud, is in the tractate of Shabbat, in the portion of how to light a Shabbat candle. And Shabbat candles are for creating peace in the house. So what is the Hanukkah? The Hanukkah symbolizes that the miracle, right, of the 8 days that they found a little jug and had the pure oil until it was time to light to create more light. So, in a sense, what we would want to do is to light the whole menorah, right, for 8 days. That's how it was lit in the temple. But that's not how we do it. I put all the candles, but for those who are familiar, the way we light the candles, the Hanukkah, is we do the first day, right, 1, and then 2, and then 3 until the 8th day, which is a full Hanukkah. So, first of all, this is supposed to symbolize the menorah. So how come this has 8 candles, or 9 really, with the one in the middle, versus 7 of the menorah itself? Why would it not be the menorah? The seven candles, like the menorah in the temple. But the menorah in the temple had the 6, and then the one in the middle. So in a sense, we added one more candle on each side for the Hanukkah. That is the difference between a menorah and a Hanukkah. So Hanukkah has these 2 extra ones because we don't want it to resemble the one in the temple. That really is the law, that whatever we did in the temple is dedicated for the temple. That's it. That's why we don't use musical instruments, for example, in the synagogue today on Shabbat, because they used to be they were used in the temple. And since this is as the temple, but it's not the temple, we're not allowed to use musical instruments. Same thing with the Hanukkah, because it's not the temple. We're not supposed to use it for any other the candles for any other thing, and not to resemble exactly the menorah. And the way we light it was a whole discussion in the Talmud between the 2 main houses of learning in the Talmud, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai, which is the more literal, said, well, if we're going to light the Hanukkah, we should light it from 8 candles going down, because that's how really light functions. Right? You light a candle, and they have big light, and it diminishes with time. So go down. And Beit Hillel, which are more compromising, said, no, this is actually, we want to increase the light. We're going against, in a sense, the natural order of things, right? It's not about the creation, about the military victory, but about the redemption, the increasing the light. So we will do that, we'll increase the light every day. And that was the opinion that was accepted, and that's what we do today. And of course, it corresponds to the time of year when light starts to increase. So creation and redemption really meet in Hanukkah, and rededicating the house and the menorah that increases the light.
Question was, how do you get a military victory?
Yeah, could be temporary, because there were other wars that followed, of course. But for that time, they exhausted the Greek army, because they can exhaust themselves too. How exactly the war happened? I mean, in terms of like where I don't know exactly how the military, the battle happened. But the Greeks were in Jerusalem, and then the Hashmonaim, the house of the Hasmoneans, engaged the battle against. There are many stories in the Talmud why the Jews decided they've had enough. And one of the stories is that one of the daughters of the Hashmonaim was about to get married. And the law of the Greeks at that point, they were so oppressive that they said that a woman, before she gets married, first has to sleep with the Greek commander. So of course, it was a terrible law. But when it was time for the daughter of the Hashmon, the sister of all the brothers, to get married, and she stood there and she said, "You're going to let this happen?" And they said, "No, we're not going to let this happen." And they rebelled, and they were able to win. Yeah, so that was kind of the last straw. So the Greeks were in Jerusalem, but the Greeks also had many other battles. Judea was not their only battle. So they were limited as well. You can see it in the Second World War and any wars that you see the big armies lose to Austria and Slovenia or Slovenia. They lost there too, and they had much bigger army, but they lost because the people really defended themselves. 6-day war, in Israel, when Israel won against all the Arab militaries. So you can have that kind of military victory, and then of course it's not the end of everything, but for the time they won. So I think this is interesting that you're pushing that point, and I think it's interesting because it may be one of the reasons that the rabbi said, we're not gonna emphasize that, the military victory, because that can be temporary, that could be open to interpretation. At one point you feel like you won and the other one lost, but when your spirituality, when you're able to light the menorah back in the temple, you know that you won, at least on the spiritual level. So I think that's a good point. The soul of a person, we say, is a candle. The Talmud tells us it's like a candle. Our soul is like the candle. The body is like the wax, and our soul is the light. So it's infinite, really. The light is infinite. It's the body that goes away, so it doesn't hold the spirit anymore. But the creation, right? God created the world, so in a sense built the house, and then at the end, what did He do? The last thing was to blow the spirit into the nostrils of the human being. And of course, He didn't do it with the animals at all, right? The animals were all created, but they were not, the Spirit of God was not put in them. It's only with man. So that was to create and then to dedicate that house with the lighting the candle. So the December 25th, the Christmas day, we would light the menorah at Mitchell Park at 5 p.m. So if you're available and you finished your dinner and you want to come for some dessert, we'll light the menorah at Mitchell Park, and then we'll go to the synagogue for desserts and latkes and sufganiyot. So please join us. Tell your friends. Well, the first night of Hanukkah really begins the night before, right? We say
Christmas Eve.
It's Christmas Eve, which is actually very interesting that Christmas Eve and Hanukkah Eve fall together on the same day, because the Hanukkah during the day, right? We start our celebration at night because of creation. Creation said there was night and there was day, right? It doesn't start with the day. So because of that language, that there was night and there was day, one day, we start the day with sunset, really, the day before. So when we light the candle in Mitchell Park on Christmas Day, right, and we light the second candle, but really the first day of Hanukkah and the first day of Christmas are the same day. So that really, it doesn't have that much. They said every 25 years. Yeah, I didn't check. I should check that, but yeah, I remember it happening maybe another once or twice in the time that I've followed it. So yeah, it's a.
But there are great messages. I think the point is there are great messages in the dates, in dating. It may not be precise chronologically, but there are dates have meaning. All right? That's why, for example, in Italy, your birthday is not important. The day that's most important is the day you receive your name. The onomastico, as they call it. Your name day is more important than your birthday. So all of these feasts and so on, take on different meanings and have depths of meaning. Yeah, I just, it's something that astronomically that the Magi would follow. Not exactly sure in the development of that story, which is obviously not historical as such. I mean, all of the meaning is there, however. So all of the elements take on a very definite meaning. The star, I'm not too sure of, but one of the interpretations would be on Christmas. All right, Luke's gospel talks about the shepherds and so on. Okay, in theological parlance, on that night, Jesus was revealed to the Jews. That they were Jewish shepherds that came. 12 days later, when the Magi came, since they were Gentiles, the meaning is that Jesus is now revealed to the Gentiles, and therefore the completion of all of humanity. And then the 12 days of Christmas, the number 12 signifies perfection. So it all comes together. But there are all sorts of meanings and symbolic meanings of what goes on in these stories.
5 o'clock on December 25th. Yeah. Oh, yep, Sunday the 25th.
Okay.
And it happened to be also on a Sunday, because we normally light the menorah on Sunday, whatever Sunday it is. It's 8 days of Hanukkah, there's always a Sunday. So whatever the Sunday is, we light the menorah. Doesn't matter how many candles we light it on the Sunday. And it happened that this year, the Sunday is also Christmas. No what? Oh, you really? For Christmas and one for Sunday? Wow.
Okay?
Wow.
Good Catholic.
Very good.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful Christmas.